and does our bidding. Or at least, that was the original plan. In all of human history, there has never been a better time to be a fire. We are now almost totally dependent on fire, and the products it facilitates for food, shelter, heat, transportation, medicines, and every object we use. Fire, as far as we know, is unique to our planet. A relative newcomer, it has occurred on Earth for about 500 million years. If the planet's history were expressed as a century, fire's presence would occupy only the past decade or so. Fire, to be clear, is not the same as heat, which is abundant in the universe. The sun radiates heat, but it's not on fire in the earthly sense. Earthly fire, our fire, is different. It's not a thing, or a gas, or an element. It is a chemical reaction. But before there was life on Earth, this reaction was not possible. Life, specifically plant life and the oxygen it generates, is the sine qua non for fire. Long before we climbed down from the tree, up into them, not only would photosynthesis provide the gas required for the first ignitions, its agents, plant life, were storehouses of fuel. Hydrocarbons, in the form of wood, stems, leaves, and grasses. Any complex creature that moves does so thanks to oxygen, and the primary reason animals move is to find more food to consume, and ultimately to oxidize, to burn, in the form of energy transmitted to and through their blood. Fire is driven by the same need. In this sense, fire is not an element or a reaction. It's a hunter, just like us. Oxygen is our trail boss, driving us through the world on an endless quest for energy to burn. We are, in fact, oxygen's hostages. If in doubt, don't inhale for 30 seconds and notice how you feel. Suffocation is a grave risk faced by all burners and breathers. Every breath we take staves off imminent death. With this barely conscious rhythm of self-resuscitation, we save our lives about 20,000 times a day. In the first 45 seconds of stifled breath, you will lose your manners, your language, your loyalties, your love, and with them 10 million years of evolution, winding up wide-eyed and flaming, somewhere lower than an ape. In the next 45 seconds, your evolutionary clock will spin back, perhaps 200 million years, until you resemble a lizard, a savage, soulless vehicle for raw impulse, focused with all your being on one crushing need. And in your final seconds, with your lungs ablaze and not a thought left in your head, you might be reduced to something a lot like fire, an appetite for oxygen, the animating gas, with nothing left of yourself but a chemical reaction dying to happen. Our last mortal act is not to move or eat or procreate, but to strip oxygen molecules from our environment. Then, like a smothered fire, we flicker and die. If you look at how humans, undisciplined and unregulated by education or culture, use resources, they tend to consume whatever is available until it's gone. Of course, fire does this too. A key difference between us is that fire has no control over its rate of consumption, but we do, even if it's hard to tell sometimes. Because of this capacity for self-awareness, science has generously named our species Homo sapiens, wise men. However, given the degree to which we are now determined by our relationship to fire and its avatar, the petroleum industry, there's a case to be made for a revision. I propose Homo flagrans, burning man. Since the last days of April 2016, fires had been a throbbing presence on the horizon around the city. This was Fire 009, the 9th substantial fire discovered in the Fort McMurray Fire District that year. 009 was not a day old, but already it was clear that this one was different. Since it was first spotted on Sunday, May 1st, it had increased in size by 500 times. Much of that growth was towards the city, and some preemptive evacuations were ordered. By 10 a.m. on Monday the 2nd, the fire had expanded to 2,000 acres. An hour later, over 3,000. Then it doubled again. Despite the efforts of firefighters, no containment had been achieved. Witnesses described a raging crown fire that sent jet-like whorls of flame spiraling into the smoky sky. The plume was gigantic and plainly visible 80 miles away. Once a wildfire reaches this level of intensity, there will be no further attempts to confront it directly. Instead, the focus is on the flanks and on removing potential fuel in hopes of slowing down its progress. On the evening of May 2nd, Fire 009 did something no fire ought to be doing at that hour. Energized by its own ferocious heat and by winds that should have settled down at dusk, it drove embers across the Athabasca River, where they started a new fire. The width of the Athabasca outside Fort McMurray is 1/3 of a mile. The fire, already within striking distance of the south of the city, now had a beachhead on the north side of the river and ready access to the most densely settled neighborhoods. Even in its nascent stages, it was capable of surmounting any obstacle nature or humans could put in its way. It had now arranged itself in a double-flanked pincer movement. After nightfall, it settled down to wait out the dark, nursing itself on the exceptionally dry ground fuel. Sunrise on May 3rd would be at 5:33. The rest was up to the wind. The forests of Alberta had seen this behavior only once before. In 2001, the story of the Chisholm Fire has attained a legendary status. A senior wildfire expert in Alberta received a call from Washington, D.C. While monitoring global weather data from a satellite feed, the American detected a mysterious aerosol signature in the form of a smoke plume that penetrated the tropopause, the atmospheric barrier containing most earthly emissions, and kept rising far into the stratosphere, topping out at 45,000 feet. The signal was emanating from a sparsely inhabited area in Alberta. Volcanoes are capable of generating this type of high-altitude aerosol signature, but there are no volcanoes in Alberta. The Americans' question, so the story goes, was, has Canada just detonated a nuclear device? There had been an explosion, many in fact, and the energy released was counted as that of 17 1-megaton hydrogen bombs, or about 4 Hiroshima bombs per minute. This now is what fire is capable of on Earth. The chemistry and physics of fire remain unchanged, and trees are no different than they were 50 years ago, but the air is warmer and the soil drier, enough to make the latent energy living and dying in these forests easier to release. The Chisholm Fire set a precedent for the obliterating energy brewing outside Fort McMurray. And at lunchtime on May 3rd, 2016, the energy released there was equivalent to a nuclear explosion.
Kerry Shale was reading from Fire Weather by John Valiant. It was abridged by Polly Coles and produced by Clive Brill. It's a Brill production for BBC Radio 4.
On BBC iPlayer.
Good morning, Mumbai.
India, the fastest growing major economy in the world, with Mumbai at its heart.
The billionaire boom.
A place where fortunes can be made.
When people do well, the next thing is celebration.
India is not just a country, it's an idea.
India is finding its own. India is expressing itself so beautifully.
Streets of gold, Mumbai.
We are finally getting our place in the sun.
Watch on BBC iPlayer.
BBC News at 10 o'clock. The Labour leadership is facing criticism after reversing its decision to support its candidate for the Rochdale by-election. The party had at first said it would stand by Azar Ali after he apologised for comments he apparently made about Israel, but he was later suspended when further remarks were published in the Daily Mail. Rishi Sunak said Labour had withdrawn support for him only after enormous media pressure. John McTernan, who's former political secretary to Sir Tony Blair, says Labour didn't get the full facts immediately.
They appear to have just taken what he said and not asked was there anything else he said that could be useful for us. And, you know, the Daily Mail and so they played the scoop incredibly well to be as disruptive as possible, which is they had it, they held on to it, and they released it after the deadline for changing your candidate had passed.
President Biden has said the US is working on a deal which would involve a pause in fighting in Gaza and secure the release of hostages still being held by Hamas. Negotiations about a ceasefire are due to take place in Egypt as Israel prepares to launch a ground offensive in Rafah in southern Gaza. The Housing Secretary Michael Gove has proposed changes to planning rules in England that he says will turbocharge house building in big cities. Councils will be told to prioritise developments on former industrial or brownfield sites. The housing charity Shelter said it had concerns about the quality of homes in commercial premises that have been converted into residential buildings. 7 women have accused Devon and Cornwall police of failing to investigate serving and former officers for domestic abuse and sexual violence. The group said that in some cases the men have been promoted into roles dealing with violence against women and girls. The force has referred the allegations to the police watchdog. A motorist has been arrested for drink driving after dialing 999 to report himself to the police. Officers in North Yorkshire said the man called them yesterday, saying he'd had a heavy weekend. Police sent out to breathalyse him found he was 3 times over the limit. BBC News.
The actor Peter Capaldi is Kirsty Young's guest on Young Again this morning. If he could travel back in time to the Glasgow tenement block where he was brought up, what advice would he give his younger self? You can hear more at 11 o'clock after Woman's Hour with Emma Barnett.
Good morning and welcome to the programme. And after some of you sending me your best screams on social media after our conversation on yesterday's programme about women, madness, our minds, our bodies, how we feel, thank you. I won't forget the last 24 hours. But today we will turn our attention to gestures of love and service. It seems the smaller the better. Yes, okay, Valentine's Day, maybe tomorrow, but it seems just peeling an orange for your loved one might be all it takes. After a few so-called love tests have gone viral on TikTok, more detail will be revealed a bit later in the programme. But far from the grand gestures of creating a building for someone, like the Taj Mahal, to demonstrate everlasting love, peeling an orange for your loved one might be all it takes. And it isn't going to be an orange for yourself. What are the small gestures that someone has done for you to show their love? Perhaps it is the amazing cup of tea at the perfect moment, the stroking of your arm, a silent shoulder squeeze. For me, making a hot water bottle is right up there. But what is yours? You can text me on 84844. Watch them for those standard message rates. On social media, we're at BBC Woman's Hour, or email me. Some of you love doing that, and I love receiving them through the Woman's Hour website, or WhatsApp 03700 100 444. Also on today's programme, the first woman to run the National Farmers Union, Minette Batters, is stepping down. She will be here, as will the woman trying to tell the world the extent of the sexual violence Hamas, a group recognised as terrorists by the UK government, inflicted on Israeli women on October the 7th. But first, can drama do what political inquiries cannot? That's what the doctor and writer Rachel Clark is perhaps hoping. Her book, Breathtaking, about what happened to doctors and medical staff during the pandemic, based on her experience on the COVID wards, has been turned into a 3-part ITV drama that starts next week. Set in a fictionalised London hospital, the series tells the devastating impact of the pandemic through the eyes of the character Dr. Abby Henderson, as she and fellow frontline medical staff battle to try to save the lives of COVID patients as the virus begins to overwhelm the NHS. Dr. Henderson is played by the actor Joanne Froggatt, you'll know of course from things like Downton Abbey and many more, and the series begins on the 3rd of March 2020 20 days before the country is locked down. Let's play you a clip.
Look, I need a coronavirus test for a 45-year-old patient. I know he has no travel history.
Right.
But there is the highest index of clinical suspicion that this is an undiagnosed coronavirus
Absolutely,
case.
Debbie, but the guidance says with no travel history, we can't authorise testing.
But I was just standing there watching a patient playing a game on his phone with his sat sitting in his boots. So the guidelines need to go in the bin for a moment.
We have to follow guidelines. We have no choice.
You know this thing is spreading all over Italy.
This is national guidance, okay? It's from Public Health England. Talk to Mike and make sure your patient's in a side room.
John Foggart's here, as is the Dr. Rachel Clark. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here. It takes you right back in some ways. Joanne, if I could start with you, why did you want to play this role?
Well, I read the scripts. You know, it was the first thing you do. And well, actually, Craig Viveros, our director, I'd worked with before on a show called Angela Black, and he called me and said, "I'm doing this project." Explained what it was, and I just went, "Wow, this sounds so important and incredible." And then I was sent the scripts, and they were some of the best scripts I've ever read. And you know, even just taking it from a drama perspective, but then I then was told that every single patient story in our script, every single member of an NHS staff story was based on a real account. So, you know, it wasn't fictionalised, it was a retelling of the truth.
Did you have any idea of what doctors were going through at the time? I mean, some may have been listening to the interviews at the time and hearing people's accounts, but I wonder if it did take you somewhere else.
It did. I was quite disappointed in myself actually reading the scripts, because I did have an inkling of, you know, sort of seeing newspaper articles and, you know, different things on social media, but I didn't delve deep enough. And I keep saying, you know, that those of us who were sort of fortunate enough not to have dealings with hospitals during the pandemic, really we had no idea of what our NHS staff were put through, what they were expected to do, the risks they were put under, and the price they paid. And I shed tears reading the script, and that's never happened to me before. And I just thought, somebody has to tell this story. We have to know what our NHS has done for us.
Why did you want to write it, Rachel? You had an experience, of course, by going into this zone. It's not based exactly on your experience, it's a composite of what was going on around you, I understand.
That's right, yes. But as Joe says, we had a fundamental principle, which was everything you see on the screen is true. It has truly happened in some shape or form. There's no sensationalising, exaggeration whatsoever, and everything had to be so authentic that even a doctor or a nurse who was there on the COVID ward would not be able to tell any detail that wasn't true to life. And I think more than anything, I wanted to bring this series onto the screen, because if you think back to March 2020, when the rest of the world was rightly quaking in the face of this horrific virus, NHS staff and care staff in care homes were stepping up and going towards the patients whose every breath they knew was steeped with this virus and could kill them. And very often in the early days they were doing that either with pitiful PPE, with a paper mask and a plastic pinny, or in the worst cases, no PPE at all. There are multiple occasions of staff who begged for PPE for their wards and were told by their hospital bosses, who themselves were being given these instructions from the government, no PPE. And I wanted that sacrifice, that courage, and the enormity of these staff sometimes then catching COVID and dying in the same hospitals where we were all working, to be shown to the public in a way that I hoped would stop them in their tracks and just make them think, gosh, I thought I understood this, but I really had no idea.
Do you think people want this and need this drama? I mean, I'm just thinking back to the care home drama. I say drama, but based on what happened during COVID, which was on Channel 4 with Jodie Comer in it and Stephen Graham, called Help. This is now based in a hospital, so different setting again. There may be some who think we've had already drama of this, and now this. It's quite soon.
Yes, and I think I'm a palliative care doctor, that's my specialty, and so that the human instinct to want to turn away from a traumatic